Mark Carney just stood in front of cameras and told the world Canada has no plans for a free trade deal with China. But here's what nobody's asking. Why did he need to say that at all? Because 9 days earlier, he was in Beijing shaking hands with Xi Jinping, announcing a strategic partnership that slashed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and canola, declaring the relationship more predictable than the one with Washington. And now, after Trump threatened a 100% tariff on every single Canadian good entering the United States, Carney is walking it back, insisting it's not a free trade deal, just a tariff adjustment. If you believe that distinction matters to the structural forces now in motion, you're missing the entire game being played here. And make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what's unfolding right now is not a trade spat. It's a forced reordering of continental economic alignment. And Canada just became the testing ground for how far America will go to prevent capital flows from bypassing its control. Let me be very clear about what's actually happening structurally, because the surface narrative is designed to obscure the mechanics at work. When Carney flew to Beijing on January 16, 2026, and came back with an agreement that cuts Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola from 84% down to 15% by March 1st. And in exchange, Canada drops its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%. That is not housekeeping. That is a deliberate reconfiguration of trade flows with the second largest economy on Earth. The Canadian government framed this as addressing issues that developed over the last couple of years, referring specifically to the retaliatory tariffs China imposed in March 2025 after Canada joined the United States in slapping blanket tariffs on Chinese EVs. But the causation here runs deeper than retaliation cycles. What Carney negotiated was a bilateral carve-out from the trade war architecture that Washington has been constructing around China for the better part of a decade. And the instant that carve-out became public, it triggered the exact response any structurally literate observer would have predicted. Trump threatened to annihilate Canadian access to the U.S. market unless Canada fell back in line. Now, Carney's response is to invoke the non-market economy clause in CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, which replaced NAFTA. He says Canada can't pursue free trade agreements with non-market economies without prior notification to its partners. And he's technically correct. Article 32.10 of CUSMA requires that if any member country enters free trade negotiations with a non-market economy, it must notify the other members at least 3 months in advance, and those other members can terminate KSMO on 6 months' notice and replace it with a bilateral agreement that excludes the defecting party. But here's what Carney isn't saying. The threshold that triggers that clause is a free trade agreement. Whether what he signed in Beijing qualifies as a free trade agreement or just a sectoral tariff reduction is not a legal question. It's a political one. And Trump has already decided the answer. When Trump posted on Truth Social that Canada was trying to become a drop-off port for China to smuggle goods into the United States, and that if Canada makes a deal with China, it will face an immediate 100% tariff on all Canadian goods. He wasn't referring to some hypothetical future free trade agreement. He was referring to the deal Carney already signed. The distinction Carney is now emphasizing that this is not a comprehensive free trade agreement, but merely a correction of recent tariff escalations, is irrelevant to the structural logic Trump is enforcing. What matters to Washington is that Canada has opened a material channel for Chinese goods and capital to access North American markets outside U.S. control, and that channel must be closed, or Canada must be severed from the U.S. economy. The reason this matters is not because of the specific products involved. Canola and electric vehicles are significant, but they're not the systemic threat. The threat is the precedent. If Canada can negotiate bilateral sectoral deals with China that reduce tariffs and increase trade flows, then the entire architecture of economic containment that the United States has been building around China begins to leak. And not just leak at the margins. Canada is the United States' second largest trading partner. In 2024, the U.S. imported $422 billion in goods from Canada and exported $348 billion, resulting in a U.S. trade deficit of $74 billion. But when you include services where the U.S. runs a surplus with Canada due to cross-border tourism and financial services, The trade relationship is roughly balanced. More importantly, the integration is deep. Automotive supply chains cross the border multiple times during production. Energy flows are structural. The U.S. imported more crude oil from Canada than from any other country in 2025, and refineries in the Gulf states depend on that supply to function. Disrupting this relationship imposes costs on both sides, but the asymmetry is brutal. Canada sends roughly 75% of its total exports to the United States. The U.S. sends less than 20% of its exports to Canada. In a trade war, Canada loses. So why did Carney go to Beijing at all? Trump has been using tariffs as a weapon since before he even took office in January 2025. In February 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, 10% on oil and energy, citing border security and fentanyl flows as justification under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Canada retaliated with 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of U.S. goods immediately and announced plans to expand that to 125 billion. By March, Trump escalated further, threatening to shut down Canadian automobile manufacturing entirely if Canada didn't drop what he called egregious tariffs. Then, in July, Trump announced a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods not compliant with COSMA, scheduled for August 1st. Throughout this period, Carney's government was caught in an impossible bind. Canada's economy is too small and too dependent on U.S. market access to win a tariff war, but capitulating without retaliation would signal total vulnerability and invite further demands. So Carney did what any rational actor in his position would do. He started looking for leverage outside the bilateral relationship, and the only counterweight to U.S. economic pressure with sufficient scale is China. Now, let's walk through the structural mechanism that makes this a zero-sum confrontation from Washington's perspective. The United States does not view trade policy as a technocratic exercise in comparative advantage and welfare optimization. It views trade policy as a tool of geopolitical control. The logic is straightforward. Economic interdependence creates leverage, and that leverage can be weaponized to enforce alignment on security and strategic priorities. For the past 2 decades, U.S. policy toward China has been premised on the idea that deep economic integration would either liberalize China's political system or, at a minimum, constrain its strategic ambitions through mutual dependence. That premise collapsed. By the mid-2010s, it was clear that China was using access to its market and its position in global supply chains not to integrate into a U.S.-led order, but to build an alternative pole of economic power. The response from Washington, bipartisan and accelerating under both Trump and Biden, was to decouple. Not completely because the integration is too deep for that to be feasible without catastrophic costs, but selectively in sectors deemed strategically sensitive. Semiconductors, telecommunications, electric vehicles, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing. The goal is to prevent China from achieving technological dominance in the industries that will define economic and military power in the 21st century, and to prevent Chinese capital from penetrating allied economies in ways that create dependence or provide pathways for espionage and influence. This is where Canada's deal with China becomes intolerable from Washington's perspective. Electric vehicles are not just cars. They are rolling data centers embedded with sensors, connected to networks, and increasingly integrated into critical infrastructure through vehicle-to-grid technology, allowing Chinese EVs into North American markets at scale, even if they enter through Canada, which creates a national security vulnerability that U.S. intelligence and defense agencies view as unacceptable. The fact that Carney negotiated permission for China to export up to 49,000 EVs annually into Canada at a 6.1% tariff, down from 100%, directly undermines the U.S. effort to exclude Chinese automotive technology from the continent. And because automotive supply chains are integrated across the U.S.-Canada border, and because vehicles and components move freely under CUSMA, there is no practical way to prevent those Chinese vehicles or their components from entering the U.S. market once they're in Canada. Trump's accusation that Canada is becoming a drop-off port for China is structurally accurate. The entire point of a continental free trade zone is to eliminate internal barriers, which means once goods enter any member country, they can flow to the others. If Canada starts importing Chinese goods at low tariffs, while the US maintains high tariffs on the same goods, Canada becomes a transshipment hub, and the US loses control of what enters its market. The same logic applies to canola, but the mechanism is different. China is the largest export market for Canadian canola. And when China imposed 84% tariffs on Canadian canola in March 2025, it devastated Canadian farmers and closed off billions in annual export revenue. Carney's deal to bring that tariff back down to 15% restores a critical market for Canadian agriculture. But it also signals to other U.S. allies that if you break ranks with Washington's China policy, Beijing will reward you with market access. That creates an incentive structure that erodes the solidarity Washington needs to sustain its containment strategy. If Canada can negotiate its way out of Chinese retaliation by offering concessions on EVs, then other countries facing Chinese economic coercion will calculate that they can do the same, and the coalition fractures. This is not speculative. This is how incentive structures operate in decentralized systems. Every defection makes the next defection more likely. And once the cascade starts, the hegemon either has to pay an ever-increasing price to hold the coalition together, or it has to enforce discipline through punishment. Trump chose punishment. The 100% tariff threat is not a negotiating tactic. It's a credibility restoration mechanism. If Canada can defy U.S. strategic priorities without suffering catastrophic economic consequences, then U.S. threats lose their coercive power, and the entire architecture of alliance management collapses. Now here's the part that most analysts are missing. Carney's pivot to China is not driven by ideology or some naive belief that Canada can balance between Washington and Beijing. It's driven by arithmetic. Canada's economy grew 2.3% in 2024, but that growth is fragile and heavily dependent on exports, particularly in energy and agriculture. Trump's tariffs, even the ones that were partially walked back or paused, inflicted measurable damage on Canadian exporters and created massive uncertainty that froze investment decisions. Carney, who took office as Prime Minister after Justin Trudeau resigned in late 2025, came in with a mandate to stabilize the economy and reduce Canada's vulnerability to U.S. trade policy volatility. His explicit goal stated during the Beijing trip is to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% by 2030. That is not a marginal adjustment. That is a strategic reorientation of trade flows. And the reason Carney is pursuing it is that Canada's dependence on the U.S. market has become an existential vulnerability in an era where U.S. trade policy is erratic, weaponized, and driven by domestic political dynamics that have nothing to do with Canadian interests. But here's the trap. The more Canada diversifies away from the U.S. market, the more it threatens the leverage that makes the U.S.-C relationship stable from Washington's perspective. The United States has historically treated Canada as a reliable junior partner precisely because Canada had no alternative. If Canada's economy depended on the U.S. for 3/4 of its export revenue, then Canadian policy had to stay aligned with U.S. preferences, or Canada would suffer unacceptable costs. That alignment wasn't enforced through formal hierarchy. It was enforced through structural dependence. But if Canada reduces that dependence by building deep trade ties with China, then the leverage disappears, and the U.S. has to either tolerate a truly independent Canadian foreign economic policy, or it has to actively prevent that independence from emerging. Trump has chosen prevention, and the mechanism he's using is the same one he's used throughout his presidency: the threat of economic annihilation. Let's be clear about what a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods means. It means that for every dollar of Canadian product entering the U.S., the importer pays $2, one to Canada, one to the U.S. government. At that tariff level, Canadian exports to the United States become uncompetitive across virtually every sector: lumber, aluminum, steel, machinery, automobiles, oil, natural gas, agriculture. All of it gets priced out of the market overnight. The immediate impact would be catastrophic for Canadian exporters, particularly in manufacturing and energy, where supply chains are integrated and switching suppliers is not instantaneous. The secondary impact would hit the Canadian dollar, which would depreciate sharply as export revenues collapse, creating inflationary pressure on imports and reducing Canadian purchasing power. The tertiary impact would be a recession as export-dependent industries contract, unemployment rises, and fiscal revenues decline. Carney knows this. Every economist in Ottawa knows this. And yet, Carney went to Beijing anyway, because the alternative was to accept permanent subordination to U.S. economic coercion with no countervailing leverage. Now we arrive at the present moment. Carney is insisting that Canada has no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China. And technically, he can make that claim because what he signed in Beijing is not a comprehensive FTA. It's a sectoral agreement targeting specific tariff lines. But the distinction is semantic, not structural. The structural reality is that Canada has opened a material trade channel with China that operates outside the framework Washington is trying to impose, and Trump has declared that unacceptable. Carney's next move is constrained. He cannot fully reverse the China deal without losing all credibility domestically and signaling that Canada has zero autonomy in trade policy. But he also cannot proceed with deeper engagement with China without triggering the 100% tariff, which would destroy the Canadian economy. So he's trying to thread a needle, claiming the China deal is not what Trump says it is, invoking the CUSMA rules to argue that Canada is complying with its treaty obligations, and hoping that Trump backs down or gets distracted. But Trump is not going to back down because this is not about the specific deal Carney signed. It's about the precedent and the structural trajectory. If Canada can negotiate bilateral sectoral deals with China that materially increase trade flows, then the door is open for deeper engagement over time. And that deeper engagement will give Canada the leverage to resist U.S. pressure on future issues. Trump's threat is designed to close that door permanently by making the cost of engagement with China higher than any conceivable benefit. And the mechanism he's using, the 100% tariff, is credible precisely because Trump has demonstrated repeatedly that he's willing to blow up trade relationships to enforce his preferred outcomes. He did it with China in 2018 and 2019. He did it with Canada and Mexico in 2025. He's doing it again now. The pattern is consistent and the logic is clear. Subordinate partners must stay subordinate or the costs become unmanageable. What happens next depends on Carney's calculation of pain thresholds. If he believes that Canada can absorb a 100% tariff for long enough to force Trump into a negotiation where Canada retains some version of the China deal, then he'll hold his position and dare Trump to follow through. But that's an extraordinarily high-risk strategy because the economic damage from a 100% tariff would be immediate and severe. And there's no guarantee Trump would negotiate rather than simply wait for Canada's economy to collapse and force Carney out of office. The more likely scenario is that Carney tries to offer symbolic concessions that allow Trump to claim victory without Canada fully abandoning the China relationship. Maybe Canada agrees to cap the number of Chinese EVs entering the market at a lower level than the 49,000 negotiated in Beijing. Maybe Canada agrees to additional screening mechanisms for Chinese investment or data security protocols that address U.S. national security concerns. But even these half measures require Trump to accept that Canada has some degree of autonomy, and it's not clear Trump is willing to accept that. The deeper issue is that this conflict is not really about Canada at all. It's about the global trade architecture and who controls the rules. The United States built the post-World War II trading system on the premise that open markets and interdependence would reinforce U.S. geopolitical dominance by tying other countries into a U.S.-led economic order. That system worked as long as the U.S. was the dominant source of capital, technology, and market access, and as long as potential challengers like China were too weak or too poor to offer an alternative. But China is no longer weak or poor. It's the world's second largest economy, the largest trading partner for more countries than the U.S., and increasingly a source of capital and technology that rivals or exceeds what the U.S. can offer, particularly in manufacturing, infrastructure, and now electric vehicles. The U.S. response has been to abandon the pretense of a rule-based system and move toward naked power politics. You're either with us or against us, and if you're against us, we'll use tariffs, sanctions, and financial exclusion to force compliance. Canada is caught in the middle of this transition. and there is no comfortable position. Aligning fully with the U.S. means accepting economic vulnerability to U.S. policy volatility and foregoing opportunities in the Chinese market. Aligning with China means risking economic annihilation through U.S. tariffs and probably facing additional pressure through security alliances, since Canada is a member of NATO and Five Eyes intelligence sharing. Trying to balance between the two means angering both and gaining the benefits of neither. Carney's attempt to navigate this impossible trilemma by pursuing limited engagement with China while insisting it doesn't violate KSMA is understandable, but it's not going to work because the structural forces don't allow for a middle path. The US and China are moving towards systemic decoupling, not because either side wants to bear the costs, but because the logic of strategic competition makes continued deep integration untenable. And as that decoupling accelerates, every country with significant economic ties to both powers is going to be forced to choose. For Canada, the choice is particularly brutal because the asymmetry of dependence is so extreme. Canada's entire economic model for the past 50 years has been predicated on frictionless access to the U.S. market. That access allowed Canada to punch above its weight economically by specializing in sectors where it has a comparative advantage and exporting the output to a market 10 times larger. But that model only works if the U.S. keeps the border open. And Trump has made it clear he's willing to close it whenever Canadian policy diverges from U.S. preferences. The structural implication is that Canada either accepts permanent policy subordination to Washington or it has to fundamentally restructure its economy to reduce dependence on U.S. market access. The latter is possible in theory, but it would take decades, require massive investment in new trade relationships, and likely result in lower living standards during the transition. No Canadian government is going to voluntarily choose that path unless the alternative becomes genuinely unbearable. And that's where we are right now. Carney went to Beijing because Trump's tariffs made the status quo unbearable. Trump threatened 100% tariffs because Carney's Beijing deal made the status quo unbearable. From Washington's perspective, both sides are trapped in a dynamic where the costs of backing down are political and strategic, not just economic, which means neither side can afford to be seen as losing. The most likely resolution is some kind of face-saving compromise where Canada scales back its China engagement just enough to avoid triggering the full tariff, and Trump declares victory without fully closing the door on Canadian autonomy. But even that outcome doesn't resolve the underlying structural problem, which is that the global trading system is fracturing along geopolitical lines, and middle powers like Canada are being forced to choose sides in a way they haven't been since the Cold War. The final point that needs to be understood is that this is not a trade dispute in the conventional sense. Conventional trade disputes are about market access, tariff levels, and regulatory barriers. And they're resolved through negotiation and compromise because both sides benefit from increased trade. What's happening here is different. This is a contest over geopolitical alignment where trade flows are being used as a weapon to enforce strategic discipline. The U.S. is not trying to maximize the volume of trade with Canada. It's trying to prevent Canada from becoming a conduit for Chinese goods and capital into North American markets. And it's willing to sacrifice trade volume to achieve that goal. China, conversely, is trying to use market access as a reward for countries that break ranks with the U.S. containment strategy. And it's willing to offer significant economic concessions to create cracks in the coalition. Canada is the battlefield, but the war is between Washington and Beijing, and the stakes are control of the 21st century economic order. Carney's statement that Canada has no plans for a free trade deal with China is an attempt to de-escalate without surrendering. But the structural forces at work don't respond to verbal assurances. They respond to trade flows, capital movements, and the incentive structures those flows create. As long as Canadian exports to China are increasing and Chinese goods are entering Canada at reduced tariffs, the structural trajectory points toward deeper integration, regardless of what Carney calls it. And as long as that trajectory continues, Trump's threat remains active because the threat is not about semantics. It's about control. The United States is signaling that no ally, not even Canada, can pursue independent trade relationships with China without facing catastrophic consequences. And that signal is aimed not just at Ottawa, but at every capital in the world that's watching this play out. If Canada can be forced back into line through the threat of total economic destruction, then every other middle power knows the same tool is available against them. So when Carney says Canada has no intention of pursuing a free trade deal with China, what he's really saying is that Canada cannot afford to pursue one because the US has made it clear the costs are prohibitive. And when Trump hears that, he knows he's won, at least for now. But the structural pressures that pushed Canada toward China in the first place have not gone away. U.S. trade policy is still erratic and weaponized. Canadian dependence on the U.S. market is still a vulnerability. And China is still offering an alternative that looks increasingly attractive the more abusive Washington becomes. This is not over. It's just paused. And the next time Trump imposes tariffs on Canada for reasons that have nothing to do with Canadian policy, Carney or whoever's running Canada at that point will be forced to make the same calculation again, capitulate, or find leverage elsewhere. The only difference is that next time, everyone will remember what happened in January 2026, and the costs of defiance will be even clearer. That's how empires enforce discipline, not through persuasion, but through examples.